Good evening. My name is Joseph Sitwitz from St. Joseph County Public Library, and it is time for another Saturday night story. And tonight we've got a scary one, so I hope all your lights are on. All mine are on, even as we approach midnight hour. Uh, and we have a particularly scary one today. It's a short story from the complete fiction of H.P. Lovecraft. HP stands for horrible person, but it takes a horrible person to know what's really scary, and that's kind of what the gist of this story is about. So HP probably doesn't really stand for horrible person, but nonetheless, I have adapted it, made it a little shorter because 25 minutes is a bit long for somebody to be watching on a YouTube video. So, okay, the story is called Pickman's Model. You needn't think I'm crazy, Elliot. Plenty of others have queerer prejudices than this. Why don't you laugh at Oliver's grandfather, who won't ride in a motor car? If I don't like that damn subway, it's my own business, and we got here more quickly anyhow in a taxi. We'd have to walk up from the hill, up Park Street, if we'd taken the car. I know I'm being more nervous than I was when you saw me last year, but you don't need to hold clinic over it. There's plenty of reason, God knows, and I'm lucky to be sane at all. Why the third degree? You didn't have to be so inquisitive. Well, if you must hear it. I don't know why you shouldn't. Maybe you ought to, anyhow, for you kept writing me like a grieved parent when you'd heard that I'd begun to cut the art club and keep away from Pickman. Now that he's disappeared, I go around to the club once in a while, but my nerves aren't what they were. No, I don't know what's become of Pickman, and I don't like to guess. You might have surmised I had some inside information when I dropped him, and that's why I don't want to think about where he's gone. Let the police find what they can. It won't be much, judging from the fact that they don't know yet about the old North End place he hired under the name of Peters. I'm not sure that I could find it again myself, not that I'd ever want to try, even in broad daylight. Yes, I do know, or I am afraid I know, why he maintained it. I'm coming to that. And I think you'll understand before I'm through why I don't tell the police. They would ask me to guide them, but I couldn't go back there even if I knew the way. There was something there, and now I can't use the subway, and you may have your laugh at this too, I can't go down into the cellars anymore. I should think that you'd have known I didn't drop Pickman over some silly reasons like fussy old women like Dr. Reed and Joe Mignot and Bosworth did. Morbid art doesn't shock me, and when a man had the genius Pickman had, I feel it was an honor to know him. No matter what direction his work takes, Boston never had a greater painter than Richard Upton Pickman. I said it first, and I'll say it still. I never swerved an inch either. When he showed that painting Ghoul Feeling, that you remember, that was when Mignot cut him. But keep in mind, I didn't drop Pickman for anything like this. On the contrary, my admiration for him kept growing, and that Ghoul Feeling was a tremendous achievement. As you know, the club wouldn't exhibit it, and the Museum of Fine Arts wouldn't accept it as a gift, and I can add that nobody would buy it. So Pickman had it right in his house until he went. Now that his father has it in Salem, Pickman comes from old Salem stock and had a witch ancestor hanged in 1692. I got into the habit of calling on Pickman quite often. He showed me all the paintings and drawings he had about, including some pen and ink sketches that would, I verily believe, have gotten him kicked out of many a club, but if the members had seen them. But before long, I was pretty nearly a devotee. My hero worship, coupled with the fact that people generally were commencing to have less and less to do with him, made him get very confidential with me. And one evening he hinted that if I were fairly close-mouthed and none too squeamish, he might show me something rather unusual, something a bit stronger than anything he had in the house. You know, he said, there are things that won't do for Newbury Street, things that are out of place here, that can't be conceived here anyway. It's my business to catch the overtones of the soul, and you won't find those in any parvenu set on artificial streets on made land. Back Bay isn't Boston, isn't anything yet because it's had no time to pick up memories and attract local spirits. If there are any ghosts here, they're tame ghosts of a salt marsh and a shallow cove, and I want human ghosts, the ghosts of beings highly organized enough to have looked on hell and known the meaning of what they saw. The place for an artist to live is in the North End. If anyone were sincere, he'd put up with the slums for the sake of the mass traditions. God, man, do you realize that places like that weren't merely made, they actually grew? Generation after generation lived and felt and died there in days when people weren't afraid to live and feel and die. Don't you know that there was a mill on Copp's Hill in 1632 and that half of the present streets were laid out by 1650? I can show you houses that have stood 2 centuries and a half and more. Houses that have witnessed what would make a modern house crumble into powder. What do moderns know of life and the forces behind it? You can call the Salem witchcraft a delusion, but I'll wager my 4 times great-grandmother could have told you things. They hanged her on Gallows Hill, with Cotton Mather looking sanctimoniously on. I can show you a house he lived in. I can show you another where he was afraid to enter in spite of all his fine, bold talk. Look here, do you know the whole North End once had a set of tunnels that kept certain people in touch with other houses and the burying ground and the sea? Let them prosecute and persecute above ground. Things went on every day that they couldn't reach, and voices laughed at night that they couldn't place. Why, man, out of 10 surviving houses built before 1700 and not moved since, I'll wager that 8 I can show you something queer in the cellar. There's hardly a month that you don't read of workmen finding bricked up arches and walls leading nowhere in this or in the odd place where it comes down. You could see one near Henchman Street from the elevated last year. I tell you, people knew how to live and how to enlarge the bounds of life in the old times. This wasn't the only world a bold and wise man could know. And think of today in contrast with much pale pink brain that even a club of supposed artists gets shudders and convulsions if a picture goes beyond the feelings of a Beacon Street tea table. The only saving grace of the present is that it's too damn stupid to question the past very closely. What do maps and records and guidebooks really tell of the North End? No, Thurber, these ancient places are dreaming gorgeously and overflowing with wonder and terror and escapes from the commonplace, and yet there is not a living soul to understand or profit by them. Or rather, there's only one living soul, for I haven't been digging around in the past for nothing. See here, you're interested in that sort of thing. What if I told you that I've got another studio up there where I can catch the night spirit of antique horror and paint things that I couldn't even think of on Newbury Street? Naturally, I don't tell those accursed old maids at the club with Reed, damn him, whispering even as it is that I'm a sort of monster bound down the toboggan of reverse evolution. Yes, Thurber, I decided long ago one must paint terror as well as beauty from life. So I did some exploring in places where I had reason to know terror lives. Well, Elliot, there isn't much for me to do after this harangue but to keep myself from running instead of walking for the first vacant cab we could sight. We changed to the elevated at the South Station, and at that about 12 o'clock we climbed down the steps at Battery Street and struck along the old waterfront past Constitution Wharf. I didn't keep track of the cross streets, but I can't tell you which we turned up, but I know it wasn't Greenboro Lane. When we did turn, it was to climb through the deserted length of the oldest and dirtiest alley I ever saw in my life, with crumbling-looking gables, broken small-paned windows, and archaic chimneys that stood out, half disintegrated against the moonlight sky. I don't believe that there were 3 houses in sight that hadn't been standing in Cotton Mather's time. Certainly I glimpsed at least 2 with an overhang, and at least once I saw one with a peaked roof line and the almost forgotten pre-Gamble style, though antiquarians tell us that there are none left in Boston. From the alley, which had a dim light. We turned to the left and into an equally silent but still narrower alley that had no light at all, and in a minute made what I think was an obtuse angle and bend toward the right in the dark. Not long after this, Pickman produced a flashlight and revealed an antediluvian 10-paneled door that looked damnably worm-eaten. Unlocking it, he ushered me into the barren hallway with what was once a splendid dark oak paneling, simple of course, but thrillingly suggestive of the times, of Andros and Phipps, and of witchcraft. Then he took me through a door on the left, lighted an oil lamp, and told me to make myself at home. Now, Elliot, I'm what a man in the street would call fairly hard-boiled, but I'll confess that what I saw on the walls of that room gave me a bad turn. They were his pictures, you know, the ones he couldn't paint or even show on Newbury Street. And he was right when he said that he had let himself go. Here, have another drink. I need another anyhow. There's no use in me trying to tell you what they were like, because the awful blasphemous horror and the unbelievable loathsomeness and moral photo came from simple touches quite beyond the power of words to classify. The backgrounds were mostly old churchyards, deep woods, cliffs by the sea, brick tunnels, and ancient paneled rooms, or simple vaults in masonry. Copp's Hill burying ground, which could not be many blocks away from this very house, was a favorite scene. The madness and monstrosity lay in the figures in the foreground, for Pickman's morbid art was preeminently one of demonic portraiture. These figures were seldom completely human, but often approached humanity in varying degree. Most of the bodies were roughly bipedal, had a forward slumping and a vaguely canine cast. The texture of the majority was a kind of unpleasant rubberness. I can see them now. Their occupation, well, don't ask to be too precise. They were usually feeding, I won't say on what. They were sometimes shown in groups in cemeteries or underground passages, and often appeared to be in a battle over prey, or rather their treasure trove. And what damnable expressiveness Pickman sometimes gave the sightless faces of his charnel booty. Occasionally the things were shown leaping through open windows at night and squatting on the chests of sleepers, worrying at their throats. One canvas showed a ring of them baying about a hanging witch on Gallows Hill, whose dead face held a close kinship to theirs. But don't get the idea that all this hideous business and theme and setting, which struck me faint. No, I'm not a 3-year-old kid, and I've seen much like this before. It was the faces, Elliot. Those accursed faces, those leered and slathered out of the canvas with the very breath of life. By God, man, I verily believe they were alive. The nauseous wizard had waked the fires of hell in pigment, and his brush had been a nightmare-spawning wand. Give me that decanter, Elliot. There was one thing called the lesson, heaven pity me, that I ever sought. Listen, you can fancy a squatting circle of nameless dog-like things in a churchyard, teaching a young child how to feed like themselves. The price of a changeling. I suppose you know the old myth about how the weird people would leave their spawn in cradles in exchange for the human babies they steal. Pickman was showing what happened to those stolen babies, how they grew up. And then I began to see a hideous relationship in the faces of the human and non-human figures. He was, in all his gradations of morbidity, between a frankly non-human and degradedly human, establishing a sardonic linkage and evolution. The dog things were developed from mortals. And no sooner had I wondered what he had made of their own young as left with mankind in the form of changelings, than I saw my eye caught a picture of embodying that very thought. It was of an ancient Puritan interior, a heavily beamed room with lattice windows, a settle, a clumsy 17th century furniture, with a family sitting around while the father read from scriptures. Every face but one showed nobility and reverence, but that one reflected the mockery of the pit. It was that of a young man in years, no doubt belonged to a supposed son of a pious father, but in essence it was the kin of unclean things. It was their changeling, and in a spirit of supreme irony, Pickman had given the features a very perceptible resemblance to his own. By this time, Pickman had lighted a lamp in the adjoining room and was politely holding open a door for me, asking if I would care to see his modern studies. God, how that man could paint. There was a study called the Subway Incident, in which a flock of vile things was clambering up from some unknown catacomb through a crack in the floor on Boylston Street subway and attacking a crowd of people on the platform. Another showed a dance on Copp's Hill among the tombs with the background of today. Then there were a number of cellar views with monsters creeping through holes and rifts in the masonry and grinning as they squatted behind barrels and furnaces and waited for their first victim to descend the stairs. Another conception somehow shocked me more than all of the rest. A scene in an unknown vault where scores of the beasts crowded around one who held a well-known Boston guidebook and was evidently reading aloud. All were pointing to a certain passage, and every face seemed so distorted with epileptic and reverberant laughter that I almost thought I heard the fiendish echoes. The title of the picture was Holmes, Lowell, and Longfellow Lie Buried in Mount Auburn. As I gradually steadied myself and got readjusted to the second room of devilry and morbidity, I began to analyze some of the points of my sickening loathing. In the first place, I said to myself, these things repelled because of the utter inhumanity and callous cruelty they showed in Pickman. The fellow must be a relentless enemy of all mankind to take such glee in the torture of brain and the flesh and the degradation of mortal tenement. In the second place, they terrified because of their very greatness. Their art was the art that convinced. When we saw the pictures, we saw the demons themselves and were afraid of them. And the queer part was that Pickman had none of the power from the use of selectedness or bizarreness. Nothing was blurred, distorted, or conventionalized. Outlines were sharp and lifelike, and details were almost painfully defined. And those faces, it was not any mere artist's interpretation of what we saw. It was pandemonium itself, crystal clear and stark objectivity. It was, by heaven, that it was. The man was not a fantasist or romanticist at all. He did not even try to give us the churning, prismatic ephemera of dreams, but coldly, sardonically reflected some stable, mechanistic, and well-established horror world which he saw fully, brilliantly, squarely, and unfalteringly. God knows where in the world, God knows what the world can have been, or wherever he glimpsed such blasphemous shapes that loped and trotted and crawled through it. But wherever the baffling source of his images, one thing was plain. Pickman was, in every sense, in conception and execution, a thorough, painstaking, and almost scientific realist. My host was now leading away down the cellar into his actual studio, and I braced myself for some hellish effects among the unfinished canvases. As we reached the bottom of the damp stairs, he turned his flashlight to the corner of a large open space at hand, revealing a circular brick curb of what was evidently a great well in the earthen floor. We walked nearer, and I saw that it must have been 5 feet across, with walls a good foot thick and some 6 inches off the ground level. Solid work of the 17th century, or I was much mistaken. That, Pickman said, was the kind of thing he had been talking about, an aperture of the network of tunnels that used to undermine the hill. I noticed idly that it did not seem to be bricked up, and that the heavy disk of wood formed an apparent cover. Thinking of things, this well must have been connected with Pickman's wild hints, had not been more rhetoric. I shivered slightly, then turned to follow him up a steep up a step through a narrow door into a room of fair size, provided with a wooden floor and furnished as a studio. An acetylene gas outfit gave the light necessary for work. The unfinished pictures on the easels or propped up against the walls were as ghastly as the finished ones upstairs, and showed the painstaking methods of the artist. Scenes were blocked off with extreme care, and penciled guidelines told of the minute exactitude which Pickman used in getting the right perspective and proportions. The man was great. I say it even now, knowing how much I do. A large camera on the table excited my notice, and Pickman told me that it was used for taking scenes for backgrounds so that he might paint them from photographs in the studio instead of carting his outfit around the town for this and that view. He thought a photograph quite as good as the actual scene or model for sustained work, and declared he employed them regularly. There was something very disturbing about the nauseous sketches and half-finished monstrosities that leered around from every side of the room, and when Pickman suddenly unveiled a huge canvas on the side away from the light, I could not keep for my life back a scream. The second I had admitted that night, it echoed through the dim vaultings of the ancient and nitrous cellar, and I had to choke back a flood of reaction that threatened to burst out as hysterical laughter. Merciful Creator, Elliot, but I don't know how much was real and how much was feverish fancy. It doesn't seem to me that the earth can hold a dream like that. It was a colossal and nameless blasphemy with glaring red eyes. It held bony claws, in its bony claws, a thing that had been a man gnawing at the head as a child nibbles at a stick of candy. The position was a kind of crouch, and one that looked and felt like at any moment it might drop its present prey and seek a juicier morsel. But damn it all, it wasn't even the fiendish subject that made it such an immortal fountainhead of all panic. Not that, not the dog face or its pointed ears, bloodshot eyes, flat nose, drooling lips. It wasn't the scaly claws or the mold-caked body or the half-hooved feet. None of these, though any one of them might have driven an excitable man to madness. It was the technique, Elliot, the cursed and impious, the unnatural technique. And as I am a living thing, I never elsewhere saw actual breath of life so focused into canvas. The monster was there. It glared, it gnawed and glared. And I knew that only a suspension of nature's laws could ever let a man paint a thing like that without a model, without some glimpse of the nether world, which no mortal unsold to the fiend has ever had. Pinned with a thumbtack to a vacant part of the canvas was a piece of paper, now badly curled up. Probably, I thought, a photograph from which Pickman meant to paint a background as hideous as the nightmare it was to enhance. I reached out to uncurl it to look at it, when suddenly I saw Pickman start as if shot. He had been listening with particular intensity ever since my shock scream and waked unaccustomed echoes in the dark cellar, and now he seemed struck with a fright which, though not comparable to my own, had in it more of a physical than a spiritual. He drew a revolver and motioned me to silence, then stepped out into the main cellar and closed the door behind him. I think I was paralyzed for an instant, imitating Pickman's listening. I fancied I had heard a faint scurrying around somewhere and a series of squeals or bleats in the direction I couldn't determine. I thought of rats and shuddered. Then there came a subdued sort of clatter which somehow set me all in goose flesh. A furtive, groping kind of clatter, though I can't attempt to convey what I mean in words. It was like a heavy wooden falling on a stone or a brick or something. And it came again louder. Then there was a vibration as if wood had fallen further than it had before. And that followed a sharp, grating noise and gibberish from Pickman. And then a deafening discharge of all 6 chambers of a revolver. A muffled squeal or squawk and a thud. Then more wood and brick grating. A pause and then an opening of the door, at which I'll confess I started violently. Pickman reappeared with his smoking weapon, cursing the bloated rats that infested the ancient well. The deuce knows what they eat, Thurber, he grinned, for those archaic tunnels long touched graveyard and witch den and sea coast. But whatever it is, they must have run short, and they were devilish anxious to get out. Your yelling stirred them up, I fancy. But be cautious in these old places. Our rodent friends are the one drawback. I sometimes think they're a positive attitude or asset in the way of atmosphere and color. Well, Elliot, at the end of the nightmares, that was the end of the nightmares adventure. Pickman had promised to show me the place, and heaven knows he had done it. He led me out into a tangle of alleys in another direction, it seems, from which we sighted a lamppost, and we were in a half-familiar street with monotonous rows of mingled tenement blocks and old houses. Charter Street it turned out to be, but I was too flustered to notice just where we hit it. We were too late for the elevated and walked back downtown through Hanover Street. I remember the walk. We switched from Tremont up Beacon, and then Pickman left me at the corner of Joy, where I turned off. I never spoke to him again. Why did I drop him? Don't be impatient. Wait till I ring for coffee. We've had enough of the other stuff. But I for one, need something. No, it wasn't the painting I saw in that place, though I'll swear they were enough to get him ostracized in 9/10 of the homes and clubs in Boston. And I guess you won't wonder now why I have to stay clear of subways and cellars. It was something I found in my coat the next morning. You know, that curled up paper tacked to the frightful canvas in the cellar. The thing I thought was a photograph of some scene he meant to use as a background for the monster. That last scare had come while I was reaching to uncurl it, and it seems I had vacantly crumbled it into my pocket. But here's the coffee. Take it black, Elliot, if you're wise. Yes, that paper was the reason I dropped Pickman. Richard Upton Pickman, the greatest artist I have ever known, the foulest being ever to have leapt the bounds of life into the pits of myth and madness, Elliot. That old Reed was right. He wasn't strictly human. Either he was born in strange shadow or he'd found a way to unlock the forbidden gate. It's all the same now, for he's gone. Back into the fabulous darkness he loved to hunt. But the haunt. Here, let's have that chandelier going. Don't ask me to explain or even conjecture about what I burned. Don't ask me either what lay behind the mole-like scrambling Pickman was so keen to pass off as rats. There are secrets, you know, which might have come down from old Salem times, and Cotton Mather tells even stranger things. You know how the damned lifelike Pickman's paintings were, how we all wondered where he had got those faces. Well, that paper wasn't a photograph of any background at all. What it showed was simply the monstrous thing as he was painting it on that awful canvas. It was the model he was using, and its background was merely the wall of the cellar studio in minute detail. But by God, Elliot, it was a photograph from life. Good night.